Welcome to this fourth iteration of India Think Tank Forum. And I hope you had those of you who couldn't be with us last evening, a warm welcome. And hopefully you are well rested. Some of you have traveled from faraway places. I think some of us are yet to join us as you over the next few sessions. But we have a full day, and so let's try to begin and keep the program as per the timeline. Just for those of you who are with us, any administrative issues, logistical issues, Shubhangi is handling? Yeah.
Do we have Wi-Fi access here?
Do we have Wi-Fi access, yeah? She'll get back. Yes, any problems, just I think she or Anurag is there. He can help you as you have been dealing with them for the last few weeks. There is another thing. I think we start here in the morning, but we end in Taj today evening with the dinner and a last session. So there'll be some cognitive dissonance there. But I think you will enjoy the last session as well, which we will do with a bigger group of our Asian Forum on Global Governance Fellows. And so we start today, and welcome again. And we started last night with a range of questions raised about the role of think tanks, how they are transforming how they are getting transformed by the way public policy discourse is transforming, and how the challenges that most of us face in our day-to-day dealings with the public policy professionals and public policy space. Both Jim and Samir had raised certain issues. There was a good conversation last night, and hopefully we will take that conversation forward today, through the day, as we discuss a range of issues, thematic as well as some pertaining to specific operational issues about the workings of think tanks. I think it's a pleasure to be able to, for ORF to become this platform where we can bring every year a range of think tankers from India, from abroad together annually around Raisina. So it has become something that we look forward to. And as we were discussing yesterday evening, an important role that a think tank plays these days is to be able to bring a lot of professionals, public policy professionals together, and that's a platform-related role that we have been playing with regard to the Think Tank Forum. And Jim, I think, has been the force behind this. He does this throughout the year in all kinds of places around the world. So we are very grateful that he manages to find time to come to Delhi every January now for the last 4 years and be with us and bring all of us together year in and year out. I think what is also interesting is what we have seen, the change in the trajectory of Indian public policy space. So we are around 50-odd think tankers that are representing, that are around this table, or hopefully will be around this table through the day. And 30, I think, are from Delhi. Around 30 are from Delhi. Around 20 are I think around 10 are from outside Delhi, and there are some who have come because of Raisina or because of other reasons from abroad who are joining us as well. So it's what is happening in the Indian think tank space is also very interesting. The discourse, the discussion is no longer Delhi-centric, as has been one of the complaints. We are able to bring a lot of think tankers from around the country to this table for the last few years, and that number has been growing, so that's very fulfilling in many ways. And I think the kind of conversations we are having in India about public policy and about around this space is also changing very, very rapidly, as was discussed last night. And I think hopefully that conversation will be part of today's discussion as we move through a range of issues on the table. And without further ado, I think we have to stick to the timeline. So I will give the floor to Jim, and then we will quickly move to the first panel. Jim.
And equally brief and quick, I hope. One, I want to thank all of you again and welcome you, those who were not here last night which I thought was a very good opening session, although some found it depressing. I caution on that. I mean, the objective, and I firmly believe that the future of think tanks is bright for those institutions who, in the challenges, see opportunities and adapt and transform their institutions to seize those opportunities. And I think part of the objective of this meeting is to sort of find a way forward to forge partnerships and to launch initiatives that strengthen, enhance the profile, performance, and impact of our institutions. Part of that is the regional and global summits, and I'll just tick off quickly, and you're all invited to participate. The next major meeting will be January 30th, in which the Why Think Tanks Matter will take place in Washington and now in 135 cities around the world. So you are welcome, encouraged to host a Why Think Tanks Matter in your city. It's fairly straightforward. It's organic. We give the theme, and it's a day to celebrate and connect with think tanks around the world. And this year, 125 cities have hosted, but literally now close to 1,000 think tanks around the world, because each event brings together the think tanks in the respective communities. The regional and global summits, the next step, that will be the, as they say, and appropriately given what's going on today, 6 more missiles were launched at an air base in Iraq. So inshallah, the Middle East Think Tank Summit will take place in Jordan on the 4th to the 6th. On the 26th to the 28th, the Africa Summit will take place in Cape Town, South Africa. 75 African think tanks have already confirmed their intent to participate, and we're expecting, upwards of 80. All of those who have interest are welcome to join us, but it will be constrained because of both budget and the fact that we're already close to capacity. That will be followed in March by, at the end of the month, the North America Think Tank Summit, which is Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., on the 31st of March and the 1st of April. And then followed by the European Think Tank Summit, which will take place in Marseille, France, on April 22nd to 24th. Followed in May 8th and 9th, the All China Think Tank Summit, followed by the Central and Eastern European Think Tank Summit in Bratislava, Slovakia, on the 20th and 21st of May. Once again, I encourage all of you who are interested to host an event in your cities, and the future of think tanks, which already, in terms of reading many of the contributions, will be helpful and is intended to help think through what is the future of think tanks, what are the issues, and how to respond to them, will be published by Pranger Press, and there will be 2 editions, a U.S. edition and a global edition, and 50 think tank presidents have already signed on for that, and I will keep you all posted on that. In terms of quickly the logistics for this meeting, or what the ground rules are, we are governed by, or guided as best we can in the age of tweet and Twitter, is that we're guided by Chatham House rule, that no tweet or Twitter or otherwise should be attributed to an organization or person unless they provide you their permission. I also encourage not to discourage sharing, but in terms of so everyone will have an opportunity to speak, to avoid marketing or advertisements for your organizations in lieu of a comment or a question, just because it takes away from the time for discussion. Questions should be in the form of a question, not in the form of a speech. Comments should be short and to the point and not in the form of a speech. You are encouraged to put forth concrete proposals to address the policy and operational and strategic challenges we face. And finally, you should introduce yourself, since not everyone knows everyone, by providing your name, your title, your organization, its location, and when it was established. So without further ado, turn it over to Harsh.
Thank you, Jim. And since you've laid down the ground rules so perfectly, let's begin the session. This is the first session of the day, and we are hoping to look at the broader picture, emerging strategic challenges in Asia, and how Asia looks at the global order, and how the two interact in some ways, and how do we think about some of the changes that are taking place today. It has become a cliche to suggest how Asia is going to be the center of gravity of global politics, global economics, and a number of other trends that are emanating or that are shaping the global order. But I think fundamentally Asia itself is under stress in many ways, and Asia's interactions with the other parts of the world are going to impinge upon what kind of Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific. There are multiple terms that are shaping the discourse, how they emerge out of this flux, or what emerges out of the flux that we are witnessing. So some of those questions around Asia's role in this world order at a time of deglobalization, at a time of certain trends that are quite disruptive of the global order. We have a wonderful panel to discuss some of those challenges, some of those tensions, some of those issues and concepts. And let me begin by introducing Ambassador Mohan Kumar, who is Chairman RIS, Research and Information System for Developing Countries. Sir, why don't you begin? And we have 10 to 12 minutes for each presentation, then we'll open this up for a wider conversation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Professor Harsh Pant and ORF, and certainly a very good morning to you, James. So I'll jump straight in. The way I have structured my intervention, if you allow me, is to talk a little bit about the new world order and look at trends, and then look at Asia, because I don't want to look at Asia in isolation. So I would like to begin by saying I'm 62 years old, and post-World War II, at least in my living memory, I have not seen a situation similar to the one confronting the world today, which is a synchronized global crisis. And what do I mean by synchronized global crisis? What I mean is, I think I find the politics divisive, I find the economics dire, and I find society straining at the leash, all at the same time. And that is what I mean by a synchronized global crisis. In my memory, post-World War II, I was born 1957, so I have not seen a situation like this. Normally you have a political crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, etc., or you can have a Cold War situation, or even you have a situation such as the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But you've never, I would argue, and this is just what I'm saying by way of a proposition, that what we have really now what we are really witnessing is a kind of a synchronized global crisis where I think institutions are found wanting in all these three spheres, but more on that later. I would also say most people, I think if you begin with the unipolar moment of the United States, I would argue that we went from a unipolar moment to what I choose to call a oligopolar world, and then we are now in a full-fledged multipolar world. And I say oligopolar because it was a post-unipolar moment, and we know the unipolar moment ended. I think we had a few players nonetheless, US, China, but also EU. I put a question mark in front of EU because it continues to be distracted with what is happening inside the EU, but EU nevertheless was, I think, a player. But Russia wasn't there. Turkey wasn't there. But now what I find, and which is why it is a truly multipolar world, Russia is back with a vengeance. And Turkey is back as well. You may call it disruptive, you may call it whatever you want, but the fact is, it's able to flex its muscles. And now, I think we are in a full-fledged multipolar world where it's a free-for-all, and with US retrenching, about which we can talk later in the question and answer session, I would say it is a messy multipolar world. I'm not surprised because we live in full-fledged transition and every country jostling for positioning, and that's what is happening. And so we are yet to reach a settled multipolar world. What we really see is a very, very messy transition from an oligopolar world to a multipolar world. So this is the broad trend that I appreciate and see. Now, if I can talk a little bit about the political underpinnings of this world as we see it, the economic underpinnings and the societal underpinnings. If I can spend just 2 minutes on these three, we can then focus on Asia and how Asia is coping with all this. I would say the political underpinnings of the post-World War II order were obviously based on democracy and liberalism. I don't see democracy as being under any great threat or in retreat. I would argue that Brexit was actually a product of the ultimate form of democracy, referendum. So you can't really argue that it is an outcome which is not democratic. Donald Trump is a product of democracy. He might have lost the popular vote, but those are the rules of the game in the US. You can't question that. And that might happen yet again the next time he becomes president or doesn't. We will see. But what I'm saying is, it's difficult to argue that democracy is in retreat. It's just that you have more losers than winners out of globalization, and they're making their voices heard. So whether it is Asia, even Putin, and even the term, the ending of the term restriction for Xi Jinping in China, their form of democracy. I don't see too many protests going on that. There are protests in China against corruption. There are protests in China against what is happening elsewhere. But there is no protest, as far as I can tell, on Xi Jinping's third term or fourth term or fifth term. Everybody seems happy. And even in Russia, I would argue that it is a form of democracy that they have. So I would say democracy is not the issue. Liberalism is a big issue. I think there is an unprecedented assault on our classic interpretation of what liberalism holds, which is, you are trying to see how pluralistic you can be, how accommodative you can be. Can you appreciate other religions? Can you appreciate thoughts and views other than your own? Those are under stress worldwide. So these are the political underpinnings that I see, and I don't think Asia is an exception. In the economic sphere, I want to make another proposition, and which is, for the first time again, in at least my memory, I see an extreme securitization of trade, investment, and technology. There is a massive securitization of these three issues. Take trade. I mean, those of us who spent 10, 15 years in the WTO, we've never heard anybody justifying tariffs on the basis of Article 21, which is the security exception in the GATT. What Mr. Donald Trump has done is argue that imports of steel from China is a national security issue for him. It's one thing to say Huawei, but he's arguing imports of steel from China, and he has justified his tariffs under Article 21 of GATT. So it is an intense securitization of trade that we haven't seen before. Investment. EU now says that they will screen all Chinese investments. Might be actually locking the stable doors after the horse has bolted, but be that as it may. They are saying we're going to screen investments. Everybody else is screening investments as well. So that is again securitization of investment. We saw globalization where investment was actually very free, but it is no longer free. There are going to be political considerations involved in what countries allow as investment and what they don't. So that is again a security. And ultimately, of course, technology and Huawei. Need I say more? We know 5G and the politics surrounding it. So again, my second proposition is, in addition to the first one where we said synchronized global crisis, I would say the kind of securitization that I'm seeing for trade, investment, technology is quite extreme. And that is, I think, a trend that will be here to stay for the next 10, 15 years. The societal aspects are well known to you. I want to talk of global identity versus local identity. There is a class division. I think those of us who believed in free trade in the WTO and thought that the rising tide will just lift all the boats, I dare say were completely wrong. It doesn't lift all boats. And in fact, some boats drown. And that's the problem, really, with free trade. And I thought I will never say this because I was an unabashed believer that India, having done what it has done very late, we were such a latecomer to free trade, and yet we were able to lift 200, 300 million people out of poverty. So for me to now say that there are more losers than winners, at least in the West, from what happened with globalization and free trade is a fact. And that is what we are seeing. And that is something that many people did not anticipate. And finally, this anti-immigration sentiment, which is also part of societal transformation that we have seen in the West. We are also seeing it in Asia, actually, in several important ways. And we can talk about that. So it is not exclusively just confined to the West. So these are the broad trends that I thought I will put forward to you. In the context of this, I want to pick up where Professor Harsh Pant left, which is the center of economic gravity shifting to Asia. It's going to be an Asian century. Parag Khanna, a whole lot of authors have now talked about the Asian century. So my real questions for Asia, and maybe then I'll give a chance for other panelists and we can take it up in the question and answer session. The first one is, will the future of Asia be China-centric or will it be polycentric? So that is the first question about Asia that I ask. Will it be China-centric or will it be polycentric? A China-centric Asia, I put it to you, will be inherently unstable. This is what I think. I may be wrong. But I think it will mean that a lot of others in Asia will gang up against China, and it will be inherently unstable. So I would argue that if Asia is interested in a stable structure, it should really be interested in a polycentric Asia, where China may be an important pole. Nobody can deny that, and it will be an important pole. But then you will have to allow other poles. It could be Japan, it could be India, it could be South Korea, it could be ASEAN, it could be a whole lot of other players. So I do not believe that an inherently China-centric Asia can be based, even if it is based not on hegemony, but it is based on some kind of accommodation, but on China's terms. I do not believe that will be very stable, and it can't really last too long. The second question for me with regard to Asia is the role of the West. Every time there is talk of rebalancing and a pivot, somebody shoots a plane in Iran or somebody shoots Qasem Soleimani, and then all hell breaks loose. And this is, Middle East is a region, I've served in the Middle East. Middle East is a region, I'd like to say, paraphrasing an old British general, that it produces more history than it can consume. That's the problem with Middle East. Typically, Middle East has been doing that time and again. And what you're now seeing is, again, something in Middle East which will suck the West into the region, but which will effectively mean that there will be lesser resources, lesser attention to Asia. That is going to be a fact of life, frankly, because they just don't have the resources, the West, United States in particular, to be able to do 10 things at the same time. US lost that ability some years ago. So I believe, again, there is going to be a deficit in terms of attention from the West. And I include Japan in the West, even though it belongs to Asia. So if that is the case, then how does Asia evolve without Western intervention? So far, we've had this amazing luck that the United States has provided a global good virtually free of charge. You know, this business of essentially the Strait of Hormuz, sea lanes of communication, major oil importers in Asia. US has done that. Whatever else you may criticize the US for, this is something you have to accept. They provided this. It's been a benevolent hegemon in that sense. It provided a global good. I cannot see China doing the same. And if BRI is any indication, China will not do that. They will do it in a much more different way. Is Asia prepared for it? Will Asia tolerate it, or will Asia accept it under duress? India will protest. But then I therefore come to the last point with regard to India. I think we are playing a crucial role without playing a decisive role, India, as a swing state. I make a difference between, I don't think as yet, and I say this really under Chatham House rules, although I realize I'm being taped and so on, but anyway, I think one can say this, we simply don't have the heft yet to play a decisive role in Asia. We play a crucial role, we play an important role, I think, but not yet a decisive role which can settle matters in Asia. And until then, I suspect Asia will also be in a state of flux. But for me, the securitization of economics will impact on this Asian century, because the fundamental of the Asian century is that the center of economic gravity has shifted. But what if that shift is stopped suddenly and abruptly? Thanks to Huawei, but thanks also to a lot of other things, thanks to decoupling of the US and the Chinese economy. What happens then? And what happens to this Asian century because of the securitization of trade, investment, technology? So I think the jury is out on this one. Everything else you can talk of an Asian century, but I thought the fundamental shift of the Asian century was economics, trade, investment, and technology. So I think a lot of things are still happening in China, so I don't think the jury is still out on that one, but I am not so certain now, compared to, let's say, 2-3 years ago, that this shift will be so decisive that the future of technology, investment, and trade will certainly lie in Asia. I'm not so convinced about it now. So finally, for Asia, despite ASEAN centrality, and we talk of ASEAN centrality not just for Indo-Pacific, but for a whole lot of other things. Despite ASEAN centrality, despite the plethora of ASEAN institutions available, East Asia Summit, you've got ARM, you've got a whole lot of institutions, and there are some institutions which cover most players in Asia. I would still argue that there is an institutional deficit in Asia when it comes to security and politics. There is a massive institutional deficit. We are talking past each other. We are talking around issues, which Asians are very good at, by the way. Because, we sometimes have a basic reluctance to call a spade, and that's very Asian. You go round and round and say, we will see. Indians may be a bit of an outlier in that regard. But if you take ASEAN and other countries, you see the code of conduct that they are negotiating, ASEAN and China. It's taking forever, and they're not clear about the scope of the code of conduct. They're not even clear, for example, motherhood apple pie boilerplate thing, that the code of conduct should not be in violation with the UN law of the sea. What's so great about saying that? But they can't say it. I was in Singapore recently, and I said, can you not say that just to give me comfort? They said, no, that's a fundamental issue we are negotiating. So is it going to be soft law, hard law? Not sure. So if this is the situation, and I'm not even counting India, the major economic players in Asia are not India, it is ASEAN, it's China, it's Japan. And you see what happened between Japan and South Korea recently. And the free trade agreement, which would be actually huge, if China, South Korea, Japan can swing an FTA, that will be huge. It will put your TPP absolutely in the pale. TPP is peanuts in comparison to this free trade agreement. But that's not going forward either. So we have a situation where I think this shift that we are talking about, this Asian century, I would question it because of the securitization of trade, investment, technology. I see an institutional deficit in Asia posing a problem, where people are reluctant to call a spade and start building an institution where, and obviously the onus is largely on China because they are the most powerful actor in Asia. So can they give up a little bit of their hegemony and say, okay, let's have a multilateral structure for Asia where we will try to take into account everybody's security concerns, even if they are different from theirs, from China's, that is, and see if it can make it work. So I'm going to stop here, but it does seem to me that Asia is not divorced from the larger trends that we see in the new world order. So once again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. And it was, I think you've raised a number of points about securitization of trade in particular, which and the rise of Asia and the challenges Asia faces going forward. And I'm sure some of these points will be also tackled by other speakers as well as the audience in the discussion. Let me invite Asanga Abegunasekara from Sri Lanka, Director General, Institute of National Security Studies, who will be taking some of these issues forward from his perspective. Asanga.
Yep. Thanks, Jim. Thank you, Harsh and Jim, for the invitation. And I think I totally agree with the ambassador on his comment that it's a messy, multipolar world. It is messy, and basically the world order that we sort of see today, it's quite difficult to understand. I think a month ago we were in Brazil trying to understand what's some of our colleagues were talking about Chinese projects in Latin America. Then after that, I flew to China. I was in Hangzhou trying to understand what's going on in Hangzhou and the massive developments, the infrastructure projects, as well as their largest, the airport, which they have built in Daxing. At different parts of the world, I think the values that they have already, the people they believe in, they've sort of believed that that model is right for their own country. And if you go to Central Asia, they would think that that model is the perfect model. And in China, it's in the same way. And in Latin America, I would say the same way. So I want to start with a quote from Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, where he says that China's role need to be understood because most of the problems that we face today is that we're not understanding China's role and in basically what they're trying to do. And that's really important. In this, he mentioned this at the Shangri-La dialogue, and he said that this addressing the 5G issue, he said that if you're going to evaluate 5G, we need to evaluate all other products also in the same manner. Absolutely correct, because if you're going to do that, you're going to do to all the other products also. Now, I want to quote Michael Sullivan's book on leveling. It's a fantastic book he has written. Now, he mentioned about two kinds of, you see systems, the levelers as well as the leviathans. The leviathans are state-controlled, where people want the state to control the most of their institutions and more of a sort of a autocratic model. And the levelers are more democratic and more open society. Now, looking at from a Sri Lankan perspective, what I saw was in 2015 in my country was that moving from, more from a Leviathan model, which is the Rajapaksa, towards a leveler government, which is an open society, an open government. But now, in a few months ago, what happened was reversing back again to Rajapaksas, which is more Leviathan, more controlled. The people wanted the control because of a security issue. Like the ambassador mentioned clearly, we have a deficit on national security, on ensuring security to our society. So what in the Sri Lankan case was the Easter Sunday bombing, which came in, was the biggest issue, it was the largest terrorist attack. And national security was the top priority, so that the Leviathans basically take advantage of the national security issue in any country, not only in Sri Lanka, even in India, as well as in other countries. You take advantage of that situation and make sure that their system come into place, and which has happened. Now, China, Russia, and most of the other countries which supports this, and you see them supporting this sort of model, because when you look at the post-Cold War, you see even the liberal world order, the phrase was not used much during the Cold War period. It was Eikenberry who made it more popular, and it took 22 years for New York Times to pick it up and said, look, this is the international liberal order we are talking about. And when you look at the period of convergence from 2000 from the post-Cold War, I think the levelers as well as the Leviathans, we saw it as a serious threat coming in because of existence of their own systems, like the Chinese or the Russians. How would we exist if we are a serious threat? Now, I wrote a piece to ORF, and it'll be published, I think, today. It's about the Haifa port. Now, this is quite interesting. I've tried to look at Haifa port and Hambantota, what's going on in Haifa. And it's quite interesting. I think we need to accept what's going on in Haifa. Because although it's a national security threat for the United States, Haifa port has been leased to the Chinese. Now, if that's been leased and you have the Sixth Fleet right next to docking in the Haifa port. We need to accept that. So it's Haifa in Israel, Haifa port. And so that model needs to be accepted, I think, because it's already been signed. Because the bilateral relationship between Israel and China is much more important for that country. And if you look at even the Sri Lankan model, the Sri Lankan bilateral relationship with China is much more strong. And we need that. And we need the money. We need to develop our infrastructure, regardless of other concerns that's going on. So I think most of the nations would have to sort of settle in and sort of accept this role. And it's no point of sort of, saying that, okay, there is a serious security concern, there is a concern, obviously. And that's why every leader is saying that, for example, our president, the newly elected president, said, we will relook at the Hambantota lease agreement. Then he started mentioning that, okay, he's going to relook at it on the national security perspective. So just to make sure that it will not be a military base. So that's what he meant. He said that this is what I meant during the election time. So I think the narrative need to be understood really well. And you cannot sort of isolate each incident from one another. So they are kind of connected. I see, for example, if you look at the geopolitical, the competition that's going on, for example, the Russian cyber attack or Russians in Eastern Europe, you cannot sort of isolate each and every incident, and they have some connection to it. So if you look at the 5G matter, now the Maldives is running on 5G, for example, the Chinese Huawei 5G, Maldives have already signed. So now it's Sri Lanka. So when I spoke with the Huawei CEO, basically the head of Huawei in Sri Lanka, I said that you are too late. We have already done with Maldives. Why aren't you taking it? So now the concern is that we, as a national security think tank, we have said that we need to look at, when you're leasing out strategic projects, you need to get national security clearance, as well as certain projects with national interest. You would need to sort of go through a process. So our president, we are very happy to see that our president has mentioned that hereafter all these strategic projects will go through a process of national security clearance, as well as for example, our networks. The Sri Lankan network, 70% of it run by Chinese, and a Chinese operated by Huawei or ZTE. So does this possess a security trend? So these things have to be sort of looked at, I would say, carefully. And another sort of point that I want to sort of, a few of the points that I want to mention, like the multipolar world that I see is that the US, China, EU, and India, I see India as a significant pole, because India has so much of potential to rise. And a few days ago, I was listening to the foreign minister, Jaishankar, who was speaking with Samir. Absolutely correct what the foreign minister mentioned, that he said that we are, as a nation, India is kicking the problem, not addressing the problem, and China is addressing the problem. This is absolutely correct. I mean, you can take that same phrase, and you could say that even in Sri Lanka, that's what's happening on devolution of power. We are not addressing the problems. We are just kicking the problem, thinking that it would resolve. And this is quite, we see China remarkably solving this problem. So every time you have every time I visit China, they made sure that they have solved, or they have gone into a different height, I would say, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of usage of the monetary funds, or now they have gone into WeChat payments. I mean, most of the payments are done in online. And now even the phrase globalization, how they use it, even in Davos, they speak about globalization and multipolar world, the Chinese leaders. And President Trump speaks about nationalism. You have two leaders basically interchanged sort of versions coming out. But is China really globalized? I don't think so, because there are less coming into China, sort of migrating to China from the world. But the Chinese are moving out of China, but you say the inflows are less, as well as the Western companies coming in to compete with the Chinese companies. So I don't think so. But they are advocates of a multipolar world, and they are talking about a globalization. And this is quite interesting. And when it comes, basically, I will mention on the, give me one, on the depth issues. I think what killed the globalization is clearly the debt issue, the serious debt issues that's going on in the world. Even the countries that are facing serious debt issues, and inequality of wealth is the second point, and the third is, I think, the liberal hegemony, which is sort of been questioned, which Walt and Mersheimer has clearly mentioned in their works, that certain interventions in Iraq or interventions, the credibility of those interventions have been questioned by their own people. And this is a serious issue. And even in Iran, that's going to be, I would say, a total chaos if Iran has been sort of looked at as a national security concern, and before the elections, and they go for Iran for a full-blown war. So this is something that that's a serious concern. And on liberal hegemony, that you try to sort of defend that this is the right sort of the only model to follow. I think acceptance of the other models is also important, but preserving, there should be a balance. For example, one example I can give you on facial recognition systems, like, let's see, you can, as a society, you can have facial recognition system, but if you bring in facial recognition systems, so it would support more of the leviathans. I mean, basically supporting the autocratic model much more than the democratic model. So you'd have to sort of balance it off in a way that okay, you would need for a certain sort of I mean, I would say the projects, but not on the entire national level. Yeah, so I think those are the points that I want to sort of mention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asanga. And I think you have touched upon a question that perhaps would be interesting to discuss. Are there alternative models available here, or are we trying to create something new out of the multiple crises that we are witnessing? And let me now turn to Harinder Sekhon, who's a consultant with the Vivekananda International Foundation in Delhi. And after that, we'll open this floor.
Thank you, Harsh. Good morning, and Harsh, thanks so much for inviting me. For me, ORF is always like a very emotional homecoming, because I worked here for 9 years when ORF was still in its infancy. So thanks, and I think being the last speaker is not very easy, and especially after Ambassador Mohan Kumar has touched upon a gamut of issues. And in fact, so I think I'm going to take off from the 2 points which I'd based my presentation on. He ended with, would it be a China-centric or a polycentric world, and India's role. So I think I'll take off from there. And what I see is that in East Asia and in Asia, what you're going to witness as a result of globalization is a power-sharing model. There are challenges to globalization, and at one time, though we thought that globalization would carry on uninterrupted, but the very forces, who introduced globalization, mainly the United States, seems to be in a withdrawal mode. Not really withdrawal, but as was said, retrenchment, other preoccupations, still wants to play a global role. But the TPP, the US is no longer there. They're kind of withdrawing. There's a whole lot of populism, populist sentiments which are taking precedence over democracy. In fact, I would say that populism is a spin-off of democracy, because you need to win an election and you have to cater to your constituency, and hence what we are witnessing today is the rise of populism. So everyone has a little bit of a selfish interest when it comes to engaging with other powers. And over here, it's not just the United States, but even India, I find, has started looking increasingly inwards, and I'll come to that towards the end of my presentation. So there is a disconnect definitely in the economic realm, but where globalization still seems to be working in East Asia is in the security, in the domain of security, and this is, I think, a China-led phenomena, where we've had the emergence of some new exponential, there's been a steady increase, what started off as the US pivot or rebalance. Today, East Asia is the Indo-Pacific. So there is a deliberate attempt to bring India in and have India play a more important and a forceful role in global politics and global security issues. The US has also taken the lead as a benevolent hegemon to promote geo-economic and geopolitical groupings, and though this is now getting fractured, and we can understand that because Trump goes into an election year, he has been bogged down by too many of his domestic problems, and including the impeachment trial and the impeachment hearing. But in the Indo-Pacific, I think it's been, as I mentioned, the pivot gave way to the Quad, which is an important grouping. Certain limitations are there to the Quad, but the four countries and continue to engage in maritime exercises, military exercises. And what I see as a new dynamic in globalization, I think it was touched upon by Ambassador Mohan Kumar, is the emergence of Russia. Russia was in an inward-looking mode, more Europe-centric, but now you find that Russia is actually integrating not only towards the East, Eurasian Economic Corridor, but it's also increasingly looking towards Asia. And by that, I mean not just with China. Despite its differences with Japan, Russia, President Putin and Shinzo Abe have had any number of summits, and Abe is a part of the Russia Far East development. So Russia is seeking India and Japan to be its partners for the development of the Russian Far East, as we saw in the Vladivostok summit in September 2019. And this is something which shows that there are these mini laterals which are becoming an important component of the larger globalization which we witnessed earlier. And so what is going to happen is a power-sharing approach. Ambassador has already raised that question. Would China, he said that China would be an important player, would be an important pole, but other players would play a role, and I could not agree more with what he said, because if you study the larger dynamics, both in the economic sphere and geopolitical security sphere, you will see that there'll have to be both local and regional balancing, because the common threat is, or the common perceived threat is China. It is China's rise, China's role in the larger architecture in the international arena. And also the East Asian Summit, is looking at ways of dealing with this problem of China. Even when we come to the Quad, what we find is that though there are security concerns regarding China, but each of the Quad countries, for them, China is the biggest economic player. Their largest economic engagement is with China, be it the United States, be it India, Australia, and or Japan. So how do you balance this? So what is going to emerge, I feel, is a power-sharing, balancing role. And this is where I think India's role becomes important as a democracy, as a populist country, populated country, next only to China. But unfortunately, and here I'll quote something which our Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, said, I think maybe at an ORF event, where he says that he sees a fluid array of multiple poles where convergence is possible but not congruence, where frenemies abound and where it's natural to engage with the US, China, and Russia all at the same time. And I think this is going to be India's challenge, how to deal with the major powers, which throws up its own challenges. For us, the United States post-Cold War is emerging as an important country. We are seeking technology from the United States. Our relations with the United States have come a long way. But that also brings into some kind of a conflict our traditional relationship with Russia, and how we balance the challenge of sanctions and CAATSA because of our dependence on both the Russian military hardware, our historical background with Russia, and what is emerging with the United States. So this is a very real challenge for India in the strategic domain. Also with China, I mean, how far do we go with the United States as far as the Indo-Pacific strategy is concerned, which is more for the Pacific, whereas because India's core interests, core challenges are on the land, or are on the land border with China. So these are some of the challenges I think are going to come up, and India will continue to face these challenges. And at one time, I think India's story was very hunky-dory. It was felt that India would be able to overcome these through the sheer economic might, because the economic reforms had thrown up a lot of opportunities for India. But India's slowing economy, I think this is something which Ambassador Mohan Kumar, I'd like to ask him also, has forced us to shift our focus from infrastructure development, building infrastructure, creating employment avenues for our youth, creating institutes which would create employable manpower, and this entire India growth story to prevent the youth dividend from becoming a youth bulge. We were talking about it over a decade ago, 2008, when the economic financial crisis took place. And I think at that time, India's growth was in the region of 9 to 10%. Today, when we are down at 5%, I think it becomes a real challenge. And these are the challenges which I think are not just challenges to globalization, but throw up newer forces, because the US-China trade war throws challenges both for the United States and China. So under a new dynamic which is emerging, where there is, I find that the globalization is fractured on so many fronts. So where is the money going to come from? And it was already mentioned that China's BRI, which started off very well at one time, but now when it comes to, repaying those loans, so there is and people are beginning to question China's BRI. So I think that is the real challenge to globalization, and these are the questions where we need to find an answer in the face of global economic slowdown. How do we, what is going to be the next phase? Globalization 3.0, 4.0, it all might sound very fancy, but I think if you scratch the surface, the practical issues and the practical problems remain the same. And I'll end here so that we can have a longer time for the quick Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Harinder. And I think all three of our speakers today have raised a plethora of questions, and questions about the scope of the structure of the international system, how Asia looks at the world, and how world looks at Asia, perhaps, whether there is an institutional deficit which we need to acknowledge and rectify, what are the ideas driving Asia's rise, and what are the structural constraints that perhaps allow us, as Harinder at the end pointed out, to perhaps be cognizant of the ground realities in which this conversation is being framed. So I'll open this up for your questions, comments, and observations. I think I'll start with you. Sorry. Shen.
I'm Professor Shen Dingli, Fudan University, Shanghai. I thank ORF for inviting me and for assembling this very balanced panel. But for Mr. Kumar, I do have my some view which agree or disagree. I agree with you that China is not decisive. But I disagree with you that India is crucial. Let's look at the facts on Asian security and development. On security, it's China rather than India to assemble six-party talk, to mediate between Trump and Kim Jong-un. For JCPOA, it's China rather than India joined the P5 plus Germany process. After US has quit, we stay there to urge Iran not to quit. I don't see India to play a security role in being decisive in Asian security. And for China can improve on anti-terrorism issue, but China is moving toward listing Masood grouping as a terrorist group. Yes, China is not decisive, but China is crucial. With China's taking more progressive and proactive role, I think India would even have no chance to be important. For development, it's China to take initiative to create an international system like AIIB, which is one of the most transparent and accountable financial organization. And India is the second biggest stakeholder there. I congratulate India to be important or sometimes crucial. But it's China to play decisive role to initiate this. Without China to take its role, India has no chance to become crucial. Yes, China can improve for its investment in Sri Lanka, in many other places, in Belt and Road. But China is improving, renegotiating with Malaysia, with possibly with Sri Lanka new government to cater their different view with previous government. We are flexible. We want to make Asia stable. We don't want our friend to be unhappy. I don't see India to have the capability to launch new institution and the resource to make an Indian-centric new world. So my caution to you is, before discrediting China, please say something nice. Before giving credit to India, realizing what is the reality and what is the wish. Thank you very much.
So you will come to, yes.
Yeah, Harry Batita from Asia Global Institute, University of Hong Kong. I enjoyed the presentations very much, and Mr. Kumar and I were here in the same room a few weeks ago, and we disagreed, and I think we'll disagree again somewhat on a rather simple question. You suggested that the world economy is in terrible or in difficult territory. Now, I just struggle to share that observation that the world economy currently is in a difficult trajectory. The United States economy is growing nicely. As Mr. Trump repeats saying, unemployment is the lowest since 1969, and for women it's the lowest since 1953. Europe is slowing down, China is slowing down, but I mean, a Chinese growth rate of 6% is not a problem. So I think the world economy is in a better constitution than conventionally observed, and dare I suggest that some people are promoting the idea of a declining world economy in order to benefit from that observation in financial markets. That's just a small note, but as we know, it's a very good opportunity to make money when you can shape perceptions in a certain direction. What I would like to ask is, there have been a range of statements, all in the same direction. A multipolar structure is messy. But isn't that by definition so? I mean, if we want stability, we have to have a bipolar world, then we have stability. Whether this is desirable is another question. If we have a multipolar arrangement, by definition, this will be difficult, messy. And I think that is to be so this is the question. An observation very briefly. I don't think democracy is in retreat. You didn't say that. I would rather say the opposite. We have seen a renaissance of democratic processes all over the world. I mean, I'm not sharing all the methods of the climate change movement, but certainly this is a politicized youth. Living in Hong Kong as I do, of course this is now a very politicized society, a society that was only concerned about making money a few years ago. This is no longer the case, right? If I look at this country, and we don't have to leave Delhi to witness that, it has, of course, always been a highly politicized society. So we have democratic processes, and what may be in decline is liberalism. In economic liberalism, that is. But you could also turn this around and say, well, we see an adjustment of globalization that is now where policymakers are trying to adapt to the needs of the people more than they have been in the past. This would be a very positive observation, of course. And then finally, I can't resist the temptation to say a word on populism, because I think it's just overused. As Ralph Dahrendorf said many years ago, someone's populism is the other person's democracy, and the other way around. So we should, and Fukuyama in a nice piece in Foreign Affairs in 2016 said, populism is the label elites attach to policies supported by ordinary people that they don't like. So I think we should be reluctant to label every rather unpleasant policy proposal as a populist proposal. It may just reflect the preferences of a significant part of society. But the question is the global economy really in difficult territory?
Yeah, Commodore Watson, Director, Chennai Center for China Studies. This question is to Director General, National Security Studies. It's not about flogging a dead horse. This is again about Haban Tota. Sri Lankans obviously would have carried out a complete analysis, a SWOT analysis of Haban Tota has offered. Last year when the Raisina dialogue took place, the Chief of Naval Staff from Sri Lanka came and clarified that it's not going to be militarized, which is the point that you also made. The point is more about job creation and the kind of benefits that it has given to the local population. Because one complaint has been that China brings in all their manpower, labor, skilled labor, otherwise, etc. So the local population really does not benefit. But as far as you are concerned, I'm sure in your position you would have carried out this evaluation to see how much the local population has actually benefited. And even China, the Chinese professor is here. He mentioned about Malaysia on the BRI. There again, it's clear that, as soon as Mahathir came, he cancelled 2 of this, then they renegotiated and got it at 30 to 40% less than what was originally envisaged. That means it was pitched high. So it's for you, from first hand, we'd like to know from you as to what's been your assessment on Haban Tota as far as job creation, profit making, and, empowering the local population is concerned. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I have three points. The first one, I won't dwell too much on it, because it repeats exactly what Herbert said about the inherent instability of multipolarity. I mean, I remember the classes I took a long time ago, but I think it's inherently unstable to have a multipolar world. So I don't understand why we complain so much about that. I mean, that was to be expected, and it's necessarily the case. The second point is about, I would dare to perhaps disagree a little bit with Ambassador Kumar about his use of securitization of trade. I think I would rather talk about weaponization of economy. I'm not sure we say exactly the same thing, but I think it's more appropriate wording. Because what the US has been doing these days is really using the economy and its economic leverage to exert pressure on other countries. And this is systematic weaponization, which is, I think, a problem. And it leads to extraterritoriality in particular, which is really problematic. So I'm not too sure that we talk exactly about the same thing, but I would rather use this expression, weaponization of economy, rather than securitization of trade, investment, blah, blah, blah. Because I don't think that the investment screening mechanisms are really problematic. I mean, I don't see that, wouldn't put that in the same bag together with, securitization of trade issues, but well, perhaps we disagree on that. The third point is, I would also dare to challenge what you said about free trade. Well, you said that you were a strong believer in free trade, but perhaps you were kind of carried away by your belief in free trade. Because I think that if you look at economic theory, nobody ever said that free trade is good for everybody. In economic theory, there are winners and losers. The problem is with the use that was made of this free trade theory. And I guess that ideology pushed the people to oversell the case for free trade. It is for sure, there will be losers for sure, and precisely that where the governments have to step in to compensate, to mitigate the costs, okay, and the pains for some people. But of course, ideologically speaking, you had to oversell the case and say, free trade is good. Okay, but it's not necessarily good for everybody. But this aspect of the free trade tended to be discarded or ignored. And I think, again, we shouldn't be surprised that there are winners and losers. It was to be expected from, right from the start. But, the ideology went too far and, oversold the case for free trade. So, thank you.
Thanks. I just want to make a small comment. I think we are a little bit in a sort of Alice in Wonderland way because we're all using words and each of us means different things with those words. So, is democracy challenged? Yeah, I would say so. I mean, who elected the Prime Minister of the UK? Members of his party. Who, in the United States, this is the second time that a president has been elected with less votes than his challenger. But so it's institutions, that's where the problems lie. The same with trade. I mean, is it free trade? Obviously, there are rules framed. Those rules favor some countries and some classes in different countries. But is it free? Maybe you want to call it free, but it operates within a set of institutions, within a set of regulations. And I think we really need to look at it more in that sense, maybe without always trying to identify big labels, big trends. So I kind of tend to agree with Asanga when he says we have to try and understand the new reality. Maybe I won't accept the same realities that he accepts, but I think we have to try and see that the words we use mean completely different things depending on who uses those words.
I'm Nishan Dimel from Verita Research in Sri Lanka. So thank you for the comments and the talks that have gone before, and I think I'm echoing maybe what my friend said just next to me. And let me just endorse to all of you being careful about the use of two words, democracy and multipolar world. And if I say it in 1.5 minutes, I think we must distinguish democracy from majoritarianism. If 7 foxes and 3 hens get together to vote on what they should have for dinner, that's not democracy. And so I think we must be careful when we are talking about, and it's different in different places, whether democracy is in retreat, in advance, that we are distinguishing democracy from majoritarianism, or we misunderstand, I think, what we are trying to do. The word multipolar world, it's a very important word, and I want to endorse a different way of looking at it from messy multipolar or bipolar. I want to say, let's reserve the word multipolar for a world that is bound by rules, rather than by power, which is the bipolar world. The world that we are trying to describe is a more warlordism, not multipolarism. And I think it's important to have words. I mean, I think I agree with you that multipolarism used in one way can be messy, but it's important to know what we're advocating. For countries like Sri Lanka, we do not want a world in which we have to choose which power to align with. That's what the non-alignment movement was about. A multipolar world defined as one that is governed by rules rather than a warlordistic world. Is, I think, what we are working towards. And every time, whether it's Russia, China, or the United States, work on the basis of power than on the basis of rules, they undermine the world order that I think we would like to see nourished. Thank you.
The real problems of subjugation by some countries of other countries. Should we allow to do that, whether it's China or it may be anyone else? So the real problem, I think, that Mr. Mohan Kumar told, I think is the economic problem. We have to understand it. I think we have to come to the grips. And unless I think we have full understanding of that, I don't think we can really make not free trade, but a free world. Free world, I think, is just not an imagination. But I think, an idea where each country can live, I think, with honor and pride. Now, coming to that, I don't think for India, I think I can say as a citizen that India has ever wanted to subjugate one thing. It doesn't believe in subjugating one thing. It believes, I think, in living together, I think, with other countries. And here, I think, what is coming in the way when we talk of economic problem, I think we rightly told synchronized kind of, anarchy, I think, is there. The synchronized kind of anarchy is coming because we are not going to the roots of the problem. And there, I think, we have to create institutions which can rid so-called sovereign countries of the guilt that they are being financed and aided, that they are living under debt. So unless I think we make them debt-free, I don't think that will be a good situation where only a few countries will rule over and make other countries as slaves. So we don't want, I think, that kind of, there I think I am reminded of Shashi Tharoor, whom we will meet this evening, that I think, most of the countries, I think, they'll make, I think, and what we need today is soft power, not money power, I think, not the debt power, I think, not, I think, the power of emanations, I think. No, it's, I think, soft power, because if we want any world power, the new world order can only exist when the world lasts. If it doesn't last, then I don't think it can be any sort of new world order, I think. It's the world order for destruction. I don't think we need to do that.
Final comment from Shanti.
We did have a very interesting conversation. And as we debate about the relevance of India and China and looking at Asia in a polycentric manner, one also wonders what would these states or countries do in terms of preserving the rules-based order. And I think that question follows from the fact that India did take a role at one point of time, and that role seems to be shifting at this point. Interestingly, the conversation yesterday was more in terms of transactional relationships and the neoliberal order. And I agree with this argument that there's not really much of a securitization of trade. It's more of the flag following the trade now, or rather the other way around. So here there is a transactional relationship which plays out, and business houses are playing more important role. And we see a large segment of population in this part of the Asia which has been left out of the whole global governance system and the rules, which should have been applied uniformly. So my question fundamentally is, if you're looking at the reordering of Asia, which countries would take role in establishing a rules-based order? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me give the floor to the three speakers. I will start with the Sangha and move from there.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll start with the question on Hambantota, on whether local population is benefiting from these projects. And we've done basically interviews and gone to the site. All of the Chinese, most of the, I would say about 8 of the Chinese infrastructure projects, starting from Hambantota to Colombo Port City to for their power plants and many other. In Hambantota, what we found was there is local population has benefited to a certain degree, but the amount sort of expected, the TUs as well as the is quite low, and because it's been leased out only last year, the port, and the operational income is low. So so right now, I would say it's not in full function. So here is where the problem comes in, because is it used for some other purpose, or is it a long-term strategic view? Like Professor Swaran Singh, he brings it out that it is a strategic project, looking at it for long-term and not sort of short-term economic benefit. So this is where the security concern comes into Hambantota. But the local population has benefited from the project right now, but to an extent, I would say. But if you look at the Colombo port city, it's completely different, because it's an alteration of the existing geography. The 200 acres are sort of added, reclaimed from the sea and added to the, so it's more like the, so it's a development, but when I was interviewing the Chinese, the project manager, he was saying that this is not a Chinese project, it is an international project. It is done by the Chinese, but all the international players would come here, we would lease out the plots, and it is an international project. So they want it to be seen as an international, global project, tied down to the BRI. So all these projects are tied to the BRI. And if you look at the comment, actually Neelam's comment, Dr. Neelam's on the institutional. Institutional-wise, we're very weak, I would say, South Asia, as well as, now here's a comment that our policymakers make always, even it was made by Jai Shankar on that interview. He's saying that leader to leader, we have good communications and we are okay. I disagree with that. Leader to leader, we don't have good communication. If we had good communication, we would have avoided the Easter Sunday bombing. Leader to leader never spoke. Institutions spoke, but institutions were very weak to sort of take action. We would have saved 250 lives if institutions were strong. Institutions were very weak. Leader to leader, it doesn't happen. I mentioned this at the Shangri-La Dialogue 2 years ago to Ram Madhavan, saying that leader to leader, it doesn't work. It doesn't, leader to leader, I mean, it's more of a, he said, no, we could call, your leader could call our leader anytime when a submarine comes, a Chinese submarine comes. No, it shouldn't be like that. When the submarine comes, we should have some frameworks on India-Sri Lanka on security relations that we could address these issues. So I think that's institutional. We are very weak. I think the rules-based order, which Nishan mentioned, was it's interesting to talk about rules-based order. The Indo-Pacific report, IPSR, highlights the rules-based order so much. It has referred Sri Lanka 13 times in their IPSR report. Important to create the rules-based also, but the problem here is that when you drop 26,000 bombs, how do you create, for a year, how do you create that rules-based order? The author of the IPSR is talking about it, and while there is, inside the country, when I was teaching in the United States, I learned from the students that what's going on in their own country is a serious question for some of the students. And this is something that I think a rules-based order should come from the people who write the rules-based order, from their actions. And that's really important, I think. Yeah, thank you.
I just have one or two things to say. One is, India seeks, basically a rules-based order through multipolarity and power sharing. We do not want to be, as was mentioned here, that India seeks an India-centric world, which will not happen. India doesn't seek an India-centric world. And I think one of the biggest strengths of India is its democracy. We may not have all the answers. We may not be the ideal development model, but we have a democracy which is very much alive and kicking, and which creates a very positive environment for Indian engagement anywhere, be it Iran, be it East Asia, be it West Asia. I mean, it is the fact that India is not seen as an aggressive player in the international arena. And I think that is what needs to be kept in mind.
Thank you. I would have been seriously horrified if everybody agreed with what I said. What kind of think tankers would you be then? So I'm very grateful for the dissent which has been articulated, and I'll try to address some of them, and I think we should be entitled to our views in any case. So with my Chinese friend, I'm not sure there is a disagreement, because it might have been my language, or it might have been just lost in translation maybe. But if you were saying that China plays a decisive role and India merely plays an important role, that's exactly what I said. So the power differential between China and India, you would have to be an idiot to dispute that now. That's very clear that there is. My point is that a China-centric world is inherently unstable in Asia. That is my proposition. And I also say the onus is on China as the strongest, biggest, most powerful player in Asia to construct a polycentric world. That was my proposition. So I have no problem with what you're saying. World economic growth, my friend, you should meet Christine Lagarde and, the managing director of WTO, everybody else, and they would seriously disagree with you. What can I say? I mean, look, we are in trouble, my friend. Your company might be doing well and Germany might be doing well, but if Germany is doing well, so many people wouldn't rush to take those gas guzzlers just before the emission control is going to come in. So I think we have a serious disagreement there, frankly. I really think the world economy is in trouble. The important indication for me is the growth of trade should normally be double the growth of GDP, global GDP. It's as simple as that. And on that yardstick, we are failing miserably. That you can't question. Yes, unemployment, those issues are there. India is doing very badly on that front. So maybe America, it's fine. You can be a Starbucks employee and be happy for the rest of your life. But I think there are issues there on world economic growth. Democratic renaissance, I have nothing to say, and I accept that words may mean different things to different people. Multipolar, by definition, is messy. Yes, but we have not had a situation where the most important country is pulling out of the Paris Agreement. We don't have a situation where the most important country is pulling out of the Iranian deal after having painstakingly negotiated it. We have a problem. This is not messy multipolarism. This is just countries unilaterally reneging on international obligations. I don't remember that happening, ever, frankly. That's what I meant. And I think somebody made the point that there should be rules of the road. I agree. Nobody is saying multipolar will be easy. Nobody is saying it will not be messy, but we need rules of the road. You cannot have this situation where people are pulling out of multilateral agreements. People are essentially bringing a wrecking ball to WTO, frankly. I cannot use stronger words than that. Basically, the MFN has gone for a 6. If you're going to one fine day wake up and say, I'm going to impose 150% tariff on goods coming from China, India, etc., how can you say that's normal? It is not. And it is much more than messy. I really think we have a problem there. As far as weaponization of trade, I would have no problem using weaponization instead of securitization. I think it's distinction without a difference, but I will start using weaponization, and I'll give you full credit for it, Francoise. I have no problem with that. On free trade lifting of boats, of course, in the 80s and 90s, we had losers, no question. I would argue, however, that the winners outranked the losers in pretty big numbers, seriously, including in India. And you only have to look at the Oxfam report to know the way inequalities have widened. When did you last remember a 1% of the population owning 90% of the global wealth, or 80%? When was it? In the 80s, this wasn't the case. And 80s, 90s, Washington consensus was the mantra to be all subscribed. India didn't, but we subscribed very late in the 90s, for which we are paying a price. But the WTO model in the 80s and 90s was the Washington consensus. The Washington consensus, I put to you, was at least important to lift many boats. Of course, there were losers, but the losers, I would argue, and there's no way of providing scientific evidence, was minuscule, at least in a minority. I would now argue that the losers outrank the winners, frankly. And one of the things that you're seeing is this inequality, partly globalization responsible, because you have to be highly skilled and qualified in order to take advantage. If you're a welder in a Chevrolet factory and the factory shifts to Mexico, what are you going to do? you're just going to lose. And if the governments don't, as you rightly said, retrain, and there I think Canada, EU are good models to follow. On the last thing about what is happening to Asia and how Asia can confront this situation, I don't disagree with our Chinese friend that the Asian Infrastructure Bank, India is an important stakeholder. I do not believe you can have an Asia without China playing an important role. I say that upfront, just because you're so much more powerful than the others. What I do have a problem with is whether it is the BRI, whether it is the South China Sea, whether it is other issues, we need a China that is more consultative with other Asian powers. This is something I would put for your consideration, because that is what I believe will lead to a polycentric, stable Asia, in which every reasonable power in Asia will agree that China has to play the most important role. I don't think there is an issue there. But if you're telling me China has to play the role to the exclusion of others, that would be a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And if we have generated these intense passions in the first segment of our conversation, I think this proves that we'll have a very interesting day ahead. A number of these questions are going to be on the agenda going forward as well. So please hold your horses and come back to this conversation once we are back in the fray.